The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the courthouse like thunder. The judge looked directly at Karen, the woman who had stolen my family's land, and spoke the words I had been waiting 2 years to hear. The defendant's property, located at 1247 Maple Grove Drive, is hereby awarded to the plaintiff as partial restitution for grand theft and fraud. Karen's face went white as paper. Her expensive lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. The same house where she had planned her criminal scheme, where she had celebrated selling my 1,500 acres of inherited land, now belonged to me. I watched as the reality hit her. She had used fake documents and forged signatures to steal my grandfather's land and sell it to developers. Now, using completely legal methods, I was taking her home. That moment taught me something important. Sometimes the best revenge is not getting even. It is getting everything. 3 months after my grandfather passed away, I drove down the familiar dirt road that led to his property for the first time as the legal owner. The lawyer had handed me the deed just that morning, along with a thick folder of documents that proved I now owned 1,500 acres of pristine forest land in rural Tennessee. This was not just any piece of property. This land had been in my family for over a century. My great-great-grandfather had purchased it in 1923, and every generation since had protected it like a sacred trust. The property included mineral rights, water rights, and a beautiful log cabin that my grandfather had built with his own hands in 1967. I pulled up to the cabin, expecting to find the peaceful silence I remembered from childhood visits. Instead, I found a bright yellow notice nailed to my front door. The heading made my blood run cold. HOMEWLNERS Association Violation Notice. I read the document twice before the words sank in. According to this notice, my property was now part of something called the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. The notice claimed I owed 3 years of back dues totaling $4,000, plus penalties and interest. My hands started shaking as I read further. The notice stated that my noncompliance with community standards included unauthorized structures, unpermitted land use, and failure to maintain landscaping according to HOA guidelines. It threatened legal action if I did not pay immediately and bring my property into compliance. I had never heard of any homeowners association. My grandfather had never mentioned one. This land had been privately owned and completely independent for over 100 years. Someone was trying to claim authority over property that belonged to my family. I called the number on the notice immediately. A woman with a sharp, authoritative voice answered on the second ring. Pine Valley HOA, this is Karen speaking. This is about the notice on my property, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. There seems to be some kind of mistake. Oh, you must be the new owner of the old Henderson place, she said with barely concealed irritation. Let me guess. You think you can just ignore community rules because it was in your family. I think there is a misunderstanding, I replied. My property has never been part of any homeowners association. Karen laughed, but there was no humor in it. That is what they all say. Listen, I have been running this community for 3 years. Your previous caretaker was paying dues and following our guidelines. Now that you own it, you are responsible for compliance. What caretaker? I asked. My grandfather lived here until he passed away. Some old man was paying our fees, Karen said dismissively. Look, I do not have time to explain property law to you. You owe money and you need to pay it. We have a board meeting next Thursday at 7 p.m. You can come explain yourself then. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, staring at the violation notice, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Someone named Karen was claiming authority over my family's land, demanding money I did not owe, and threatening legal action based on rules I had never agreed to follow. I walked around the property that afternoon, looking at the land with new eyes. Everything appeared exactly as my grandfather had left it. The cabin was in perfect condition. The forest was healthy and well-maintained. The creek that ran through the eastern section was crystal clear. But something felt different now. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a warning bell was ringing. This was not a simple bureaucratic mistake. Karen's tone, her assumption of authority, her dismissive attitude toward my family's ownership, all pointed to something much more serious. That evening, I called my grandfather's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in the area for 40 years. "Oh, honey," she said when I explained the situation, "that HOA has been causing problems for everyone around here. They formed a few years ago and started claiming they had authority over all kinds of private property. Your grandfather fought them tooth and nail." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, fought them?" "He refused to pay their fees or follow their rules. Said they had no legal right to his land. Last I heard, they were threatening to take him to court." As I hung up the phone, I realized this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Someone had been planning this for years. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse to research the property records. I needed to understand exactly what was happening and whether this HOA had any legitimate claim to my land. What I discovered in those dusty filing cabinets changed everything. According to the records, the Pine Valley Homeowners Association had been officially registered 3 years ago. The filing documents listed my grandfather's property as part of the HOA's jurisdiction, but the signature on the consent form was not my grandfather's handwriting. I had seen his signature thousands of times. This was a crude forgery. My hands were trembling as I continued digging through the files. What I found next made my legs weak. Buried in a stack of property transfer documents was a deed showing that 400 acres of my land had been sold to Sunset Development Corporation just 8 months ago. The sale price was $1.2 million. The selling entity was listed as Pine Valley Homeowners Association, acting as authorized representative for community property management. The signature on the deed was supposed to be my grandfather's. It was clearly forged. I sat in that courthouse basement for 3 hours, photocopying every document I could find. The picture that emerged was worse than I had imagined. The HOA had not just claimed authority over my land. They had actually sold a huge portion of it to a development company using fake documents and forged signatures. 400 acres of my family's century-old property had been stolen and sold while my grandfather was still alive. I drove straight to Karen's address, which I had found in the HOA filing documents. She lived in a large, expensive house in a gated community about 20 miles from my property. When she opened the door, I could see she recognized me immediately. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "I want to talk about the sale of my land to Sunset Development," I said, holding up the photocopied deed. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she did not seem surprised that I had found the documents. That sale was perfectly legal. The HOA has full authority to manage community property for the benefit of all residents. "My grandfather never agreed to join your HOA," I said, "and he certainly never authorized you to sell his land." "Your grandfather was a stubborn old man who refused to accept reality," Karen replied coldly. "This entire area is now managed by our association. We have the legal authority to make decisions for the good of the community. Show me the documents that gave you that authority, I demanded. Karen smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. I do not have to show you anything. The sale is final, the money has been distributed, and the development is moving forward. If you have a problem with that, take it up with your lawyer. What money has been distributed? I asked. The HOA received compensation for managing the sale, she said. Board members were paid consulting fees for their expertise and time. The pieces were falling into place. This was not just theft, it was organized crime. Karen and her associates had created a fake HOA, forged documents to claim authority over private property, sold that property to developers, and then paid themselves with the proceeds. You stole my land and sold it, I said quietly. I provided community management services, Karen replied. And if you keep harassing me, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. As I walked back to my car, I could see Karen watching me through her window. She was not acting like someone who had made an innocent mistake. She was acting like someone who had committed crimes and was prepared to fight to keep the profits. That afternoon, I drove out to the 400 acres that had been sold. What I found there made everything real in the worst possible way. Survey stakes had been driven into the ground every 100 feet. Soil samples had been taken. Heavy machinery had carved access roads through forest that had stood untouched for decades. The developers were not just planning to build on my stolen land. They had already started. I called Sunset Development from my car. The project manager, a man named Jim Bradley, agreed to meet me immediately when I explained I was the legal owner of the property they had purchased. We bought this land in good faith, Bradley told me when he arrived at the site. We have a clean deed and title insurance. If there is a problem with the sale, that is between you and whoever sold it to us. The people who sold it to you did not own it, I explained. They forged documents and committed fraud. Bradley's face went pale. Are you telling me we paid $1.2 million for stolen property? That is exactly what I am telling you. He pulled out his phone and started making calls immediately. Within an hour, Sunset Development had suspended all work on the project and contacted their legal team. That evening, I sat in my grandfather's cabin and tried to process what I had learned. A criminal organization disguised as a homeowners association had stolen 400 acres of my family's land, sold it for over $1 million, and paid themselves consulting fees with the proceeds. Karen was not just a pushy HOA president. She was the leader of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. But now I knew exactly what she had done, and I was going to make sure she paid for every acre she had stolen. The next morning, I called every lawyer in the county until I found one who specialized in real estate fraud. Attorney Sarah Martinez listened to my story for 30 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. This is one of the most brazen cases of property theft I have ever heard, she finally said. But the good news is that we can prove everything you just told me. Sarah explained that we needed to build a case that would stand up in both criminal and civil court. The criminal case would put Karen and her associates in prison. The civil case would get my land back and recover damages for what they had stolen. First, we need a forensic accountant to trace the money, she said. Then we need to document every forged signature and fraudulent filing. Finally, we need to find out if Karen has done this to other people. I hired the forensic accountant that afternoon. His name was Robert Chen, and he had worked on white-collar crime cases for the FBI before starting his own practice. When I showed him the HOA financial documents I had obtained from the county, his eyes lit up. "These people were not even trying to hide what they were doing," he said. "Look at this. They paid themselves consulting fees equal to 80% of the sale proceeds. They bought luxury cars and took expensive vacations immediately after the land sale. This is going to be easy to prove." While Robert traced the money, I spent the next week researching property records for the entire county. What I found was even worse than I had expected. Corinne's fake HOA had claimed authority over 12 different properties belonging to 8 different families. Most of the property owners were elderly or lived out of state. Some had been paying HOA fees for years without realizing they had no legal obligation to do so. Others had been threatened with lawsuits and had given in to Corinne's demands rather than fight. But I was not the only victim of outright theft. I found records showing that Corinne's organization had sold portions of 3 other properties without the owner's knowledge or consent. The total value of stolen land exceeded $3 million. I contacted each of the other victims personally. Most were shocked to learn what had happened to their property. Several agreed to join a class-action lawsuit against Corinne and her associates. The most important discovery came from Mrs. Alina Washington, an 87-year-old widow whose family had owned 200 acres adjacent to my property for over 60 years. "That woman has been trying to steal my land for 3 years," Mrs. Washington told me over the phone. "She keeps sending me legal papers saying I owe money to some association I never joined. Last month, she told me I had to sell 50 acres to pay my dues, or she would take me to court." "Do you still have those legal papers?" I asked. "Every single one. I knew something was wrong, so I kept everything." Mrs. Washington's documents provided the missing piece of the puzzle. They showed that Corinne had been using the same tactics for years: create fake legal authority, threaten lawsuits, demand payments, and eventually steal property from people who could not fight back. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. One of Robert's contacts at the bank told him that Corinne had been careless with her communications. The bank had copies of emails where Corinne and her associates discussed their land acquisition strategy and bragged about how much money they were making. In one email, Corinne had written, "These old farmers do not understand property law. We can claim anything we want, and they will just pay us to avoid trouble." In another, she had written, "The Washington property will be easy. She is old and scared. We can probably get her to sign over 100 acres for practically nothing." Sarah reviewed all the evidence we had gathered and smiled for the first time since I had hired her. "We have them," she said. "Documented fraud, forged signatures, email evidence of criminal intent, financial records showing where the stolen money went, and multiple victims willing to testify. Corinne and her associates are going to prison, and you are going to get your land back." But Sarah also warned me that Corinne would not go down without a fight. "People like this do not admit guilt and apologize," she said. "They double down and try to destroy anyone who threatens them. Be prepared for this to get ugly." I thought about my grandfather and what he would have done. He had fought in World War II, built a successful business from nothing, and raised a family on land that he loved more than anything else in the world. Corinne had picked the wrong family to steal from. That night, I filed criminal complaints with both the local police and the state attorney general's office. I also filed a civil lawsuit seeking the return of my stolen land, plus punitive damages for fraud and emotional distress. The legal war was about to begin, but this time I was the one with the weapons. 2 weeks later, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. According to the notice that was mailed to every property owner in the area, the meeting was to address false accusations and harassment by disruptive individuals seeking to undermine community stability. I knew the meeting was really about me. Karen was trying to control the narrative before the criminal investigation became public knowledge. I arrived at the community center 30 minutes early. About 40 people were already there, mostly elderly residents who looked confused and worried. When Karen saw me walk in, her face turned red with anger. "You have no right to be here," she said loudly. "This meeting is for legitimate community members only." "I own 1,500 acres in this area," I replied calmly. "That makes me a legitimate community member." Several people turned to look at me with interest. I could see that Karen had not told them the whole story about who I was or why I was challenging the HOA. Karen called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a prepared speech about how certain individuals were trying to destroy the community through frivolous lawsuits and harassment of board members. "Some people think they can ignore the rules that everyone else follows," she said, looking directly at me. "They think they can refuse to pay their fair share and then make wild accusations when we try to enforce community standards." An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "What kind of accusations?" Karen hesitated for just a moment. "Property disputes, legal technicalities, nothing that affects the rest of you." I stood up. "May I respond to that?" "No," Karen said quickly. "You are not a member in good standing. You have no right to speak at this meeting." "Actually, I think everyone here deserves to know the truth," I said, and started walking toward the front of the room. Karen looked panicked. "Sit down or I will have you removed." "By who?" I asked. "The police. I would welcome that conversation." I reached the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. Most people were leaning forward, clearly interested in hearing what I had to say. 3 years ago, Karen and her associates created this HOA and claimed it had authority over private property throughout this area. I began. "They forged signatures on legal documents. They demanded fees that nobody owed. And then they sold 400 acres of my family's land to developers without my knowledge or consent." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Karen was frantically trying to restore order. "That is a lie," she shouted. "You are making false accusations." I pulled out a folder of documents and held it up. "I have copies of every forged signature, every fraudulent filing, and every illegal land sale. I also have bank records showing where the money went." An older woman near the back raised her hand. "Are you talking about the Henderson property? My husband and I were wondering who authorized that development." "Karen authorized it," I said, "using forged documents and fake legal authority." Karen was becoming desperate. "This man is not a lawyer. He does not understand property law. He is just angry because he has to follow the same rules as everyone else." "What rules?" asked the elderly man in the front row. "I have been paying HOA dues for 2 years, but I never agreed to join any association. Nobody ever explained what rules I was supposed to follow." Other people started speaking up. One woman said she had been threatened with a lawsuit for planting flowers without HOA approval. Another man said he had been fined for parking his work truck in his own driveway. Karen was losing control of the room. "All of you signed agreements when you moved here," she said. "The HOA has full legal authority to manage this community." "Show us those agreements," I said. Show everyone here the documents they supposedly signed. Karen's face went white. I do not have to prove anything to you. That is because those agreements do not exist, I said. Just like the agreement my grandfather supposedly signed. Just like the deed that supposedly gave you the right to sell my land. The meeting was turning into chaos. People were shouting questions at Karen, demanding to see the legal documents that supposedly gave the HOA authority over their property. Karen was frantically trying to adjourn the meeting, but nobody was listening to her anymore. Finally, Karen played her last card. She pulled out her phone and called 911. I need police at the community center immediately, she said. A man is threatening me and disrupting a private meeting. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found a room full of angry property owners demanding answers from Karen about the legal authority of an HOA they had never agreed to join. Officer David Martinez looked around the room with confusion. Ma'am, what exactly is the emergency here? This man, Karen said, pointing at me, is making false accusations and threatening community safety. Officer Martinez looked at me. Sir, have you threatened anyone here tonight? No, officer, I replied. I presented evidence that the HOA has been selling private property without authorization from the legal owners. Evidence? Officer Martinez asked. I handed him the folder of documents. He spent 5 minutes reviewing the forged signatures and fraudulent deeds. When he looked up, his expression was serious. Ma'am, these appear to be allegations of criminal activity, he said to Karen. Have you reported this to the district attorney's office? Karen's face went from red to pale in seconds. These are civil matters, property disputes, nothing criminal. Forged signatures and unauthorized property sales are definitely criminal matters, Officer Martinez replied. Sir, have you filed a police report about this? Yes, sir, with both local police and the state attorney general. Officer Martinez turned back to Karen. Ma'am, I think you need to speak with a lawyer, and I would recommend you do not hold any more meetings until this investigation is complete. As the crowd dispersed, I could hear people talking among themselves about Karen's behavior and the evidence I had presented. Several property owners approached me directly and asked for copies of the documents. Karen left the meeting without speaking to anyone, but as she walked past me toward the door, she leaned close and whispered, "You have no idea who you are messing with. This is not over." I looked her straight in the eye and replied, "You are absolutely right. This is not over." But now everyone in the community knew what she had done, and she could no longer control the story. #Bricks Part 5. Legal Warfare and Countermoves. Target word count, 750. The morning after the community center meeting, Karen made her biggest mistake. She filed a police report claiming that I had threatened her and was harassing HOA board members. She also requested a restraining order to prevent me from attending future meetings or contacting anyone associated with the HOA. What Karen did not know was that the police had already been investigating her based on my criminal complaint. When Detective Lisa Rodriguez received Karen's harassment report, she decided to pay Karen a personal visit. "I need to ask you some questions about your HOA's financial activities," Detective Rodriguez told Karen at her front door. "I already told the other officer that this is a civil property dispute," Karen replied. "I do not have to answer questions without a lawyer present." "Actually, you do need a lawyer," Detective Rodriguez said. "We have evidence of forgery, fraud, and grand theft. You should consider hearing someone immediately." That afternoon, Sarah Martinez filed our civil lawsuit in county court. We were seeking the return of all stolen property, full restitution for financial damages, and punitive damages for intentional fraud. The total claim exceeded $5 million. But the real bombshell came when Robert Chen completed his forensic accounting investigation. He had traced every dollar of the stolen money and discovered that Corinne's crimes were even more extensive than we had realized. She has been running this scam for over 4 years, Robert told me. The total amount of stolen property and fraudulent fees exceeds $8 million. She used the money to buy luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and investment properties in 3 different states. More importantly, Robert had found evidence that Corinne was part of a larger criminal network. She had been sharing information and tactics with similar fake HOA operations in other counties. They were all using the same playbook: target elderly or absentee property owners, create fake legal authority, demand payments, and eventually steal property through forged documents. Sarah immediately contacted the FBI. Within a week, federal agents had opened a racketeering investigation into what they called one of the most sophisticated property theft operations we have ever encountered. Corinne hired an expensive lawyer from Atlanta, but her case was falling apart faster than her attorney could address the problems. When Sunset Development Corporation joined our lawsuit and demanded the return of their $1.2 million purchase price, Corinne's lawyer advised her to consider a settlement. "My client made good faith efforts to manage community property," the lawyer told Sarah during a settlement conference. "Any irregularities were unintentional errors, not criminal acts." Sarah laughed out loud. "Your client forged signatures on dozens of legal documents. She stole millions of dollars worth of property. She threatened elderly victims with fake lawsuits. The FBI is investigating her for racketeering. What part of that sounds unintentional?" But Corinne was not ready to give up. She decided to escalate the conflict in ways that would ultimately destroy her completely. First, she tried to liquidate HOA assets and transfer money to offshore accounts. But the court had already frozen all accounts associated with the HOA based on our fraud allegations. Then she tried to sell her personal assets and flee the state. But Detective Rodriguez had been monitoring Corinne's activities and obtained warrants to seize her cars, jewelry, and bank accounts as evidence in the criminal case. Finally, Corinne made the mistake that sealed her fate. She contacted several of her victims and offered them money to withdraw their complaints and refuse to testify. Mrs. Washington called me immediately after Corinne's visit. "She came to my house yesterday evening," Mrs. Washington said. "She offered me $50,000 to sign a paper saying I made up the story about her trying to steal my land." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her to get off my property before I called the police." "Did you call the police?" "I called them as soon as she left." Attempting to bribe witnesses and obstruct justice are federal crimes. When Detective Rodriguez learned about Corinne's visit to Mrs. Washington, she immediately contacted the FBI. Agent Michael Thompson called me that evening. "We are ready to make arrests," he said. "Corinne and 3 of her associates will be charged with racketeering, fraud, money laundering, and witness tampering. The grand jury has already returned indictments." "What about my land?" I asked. "The court will order full restitution as part of the criminal case," Agent Thompson replied. "But your civil lawsuit is going to recover much more than just your property. We have identified assets worth over $12 million that were purchased with stolen money." The next morning, FBI agents arrested Karen at her home. The local news stations covered the story with live broadcasts showing Karen being led away in handcuffs. Federal agents today arrested the alleged leader of a sophisticated property theft operation that may have stolen millions of dollars worth of land from unsuspecting victims, the reporter announced. That afternoon, the court issued temporary restraining orders preventing Karen from accessing any of her assets and requiring her to surrender her passport. Sarah called me with an update that made me smile for the first time in months. "The prosecutor wants to make a deal," she said. "Full restitution, cooperation with the federal investigation, and a guilty plea to all charges. In exchange, Karen gets 10 years in prison instead of 20. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think we hold out for a better deal," Sarah replied. "She does not get to negotiate after stealing millions of dollars and threatening witnesses." Karen had started this fight thinking she could intimidate me into submission. Now she was facing federal prison time and the loss of everything she had stolen. But the best part was still to come. #Bricks Part 6. The tables turn completely. Target word count, 750. While Karen sat in federal detention awaiting trial, I decided to research her personal property using the same methods she had used against my family. What I discovered was the perfect foundation for poetic justice. Karen's expensive house, the one where she had planned her criminal enterprise, had a serious problem with its title history. The property had changed hands multiple times over the past decade, and several of the previous sales involved incomplete documentation and unresolved liens. More importantly, Karen had used fraudulent financial statements to obtain her mortgage. She had claimed the HOA management fees as legitimate income, when in reality they were proceeds from criminal activity. Sarah filed a motion with the court arguing that Karen's house should be seized as an asset purchased with stolen money. Since Karen had used my stolen land sale proceeds as part of her down payment, we had a legitimate claim to the entire property. The judge agreed. Karen's house was placed under court supervision as potential evidence in the criminal case. But the real breakthrough came when Robert Chen discovered that Karen had never properly recorded some of the legal documents related to her property purchase. According to county records, there was a gap in the chain of title that made Karen's ownership legally questionable. "This is almost too perfect," Sarah told me. Karen spent years using fake legal technicalities to steal other people's property. Now her own property is vulnerable to the same tactics. I decided to use Karen's own playbook against her. Working with Sarah, I filed a quiet title action challenging Karen's ownership of her house based on the incomplete documentation and fraudulent financial statements she had used to purchase it. The legal argument was simple. Since Karen had obtained the property through fraud and had used stolen money for the purchase, her ownership was invalid. The property should be awarded to her victims as partial restitution for her crimes. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that my quiet title action was vindictive and legally baseless. But the judge pointed out that I was using exactly the same legal theories that Karen had used against my family and other victims. The defendant spent years claiming that technical defects in property documentation gave her organization authority over other people's land, the judge said during a hearing. She cannot now argue that technical defects in her own documentation should be ignored. While the quiet title action moved through the courts, the criminal case against Karen was building toward a dramatic conclusion. The FBI had identified 47 victims across 3 states. The total value of stolen property and fraudulent fees exceeded $15 million. Corinne's lawyer advised her to accept a plea deal, but she refused. She still believed she could convince a jury that she had been providing legitimate community management services. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified on day 2, explaining how Corinne had forged my grandfather's signature and sold my family's land without authorization. Mrs. Washington testified on day 4, describing how Corinne had tried to extort money from her using fake legal threats. But the most damaging testimony came from Corinne's own associates. Faced with federal racketeering charges, 3 of the HOA board members had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. Corinne told us that elderly property owners would pay anything to avoid legal trouble, testified former board member David Park. She said we could make millions of dollars by threatening people with fake lawsuits and then taking their property when they could not pay our fees. Another cooperating witness, former Treasurer Linda Morrison, testified that Corinne had instructed her to forge signatures on HOA documents. Corinne said that property owners who were not present could not object to decisions we made on their behalf, Morrison testified. She told me to sign their names to consent forms so we could claim they had agreed to join the HOA. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Corinne guilty on all charges: racketeering, fraud, money laundering, and witness tampering. During the sentencing phase, I was allowed to present a victim impact statement to the court. Corinne did not just steal my land, I told the judge. She stole my family's history. She stole my grandfather's legacy. She violated the trust that communities are built on. But most importantly, she showed complete contempt for the legal system that she pretended to represent. The judge sentenced Corinne to 15 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all victims. But the best moment came when the judge ruled on my quiet title action. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant obtained her property through fraudulent means and used stolen money for the purchase, the judge announced. The property located at 1247 Maple Grove Drive is hereby awarded to the plaintiff as partial restitution for the defendant's crimes. Corinne's face went completely white as the reality hit her. The house where she had planned her criminal scheme, the symbol of her ill-gotten wealth, now belonged to me. I had not just gotten my land back, I had taken hers. #Bricks Part 7, Ultimate Justice and Resolution. Target word count, 600. 6 months later, I stood in the yard of Corinne's former house, watching as the moving truck pulled away with the last of my belongings. I had decided to sell the property and use the proceeds to restore my grandfather's land to its original condition. The federal restitution process had been more thorough than I had ever imagined possible. Corinne was ordered to pay back every dollar she had stolen, plus interest and penalties. When her personal assets were not sufficient to cover the full amount, the court seized properties she had purchased in other states using stolen money. I recovered not just my original 1,500 acres, but an additional 200 acres that Corinne had stolen from other victims who did not want to maintain large rural properties. The total value of my recovered land exceeded $4 million. More importantly, the criminal investigation had shut down similar operations in 6 other counties. The FBI estimated that Corinne's network had stolen over $30 million worth of property from hundreds of victims over a 5-year period. Mrs. Washington got her land back too, plus enough money to pay for home care services for the rest of her life. She called me the day the restitution check arrived. "I never thought I would see justice for what that woman did to us," she said. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you fought for what was right." The Pine Valley Homeowners Association was formally dissolved by court order. All of its actions were declared null and void. Every fee it had collected was returned to the people who had paid them. Every fine it had imposed was canceled. Sunset Development Corporation worked with me to restore the 400 acres that had been sold illegally. They removed all survey stakes, filled in the access roads, and replanted native trees where their equipment had damaged the forest. "We are just glad to be out of this mess," Jim Bradley told me when the restoration was complete. "We have implemented new procedures to verify property ownership before any future purchases. I established the Henderson Family Land Trust to ensure that what happened to my property could never happen again. The trust holds permanent conservation easements on all 1,700 acres, preventing any future development and preserving the land for wildlife habitat." But the most satisfying part of the entire experience was the message it sent to other criminals who might consider similar schemes. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about the case that were picked up by media outlets across the country. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of verifying legal documents and challenging suspicious claims of authority. "The Karen Henderson case shows that property owners must be vigilant about protecting their rights," wrote